$1. That was the whole down payment. A man with a clean record and a few years behind the wheel could walk into a yard in Fort Scott, Kansas, hand over a single dollar bill, and drive out in a brand new truck with his name on the lease and a promise painted right there on the trailer doors. Experienced drivers own a new truck like this one. He was an owner-operator now, except almost none of them ever owned anything. The company was Midwestern Distribution, and the dollar wasn't a gimmick. It was the engine that built the whole thing. Danny and Willa Ellis had started with 3 trucks back in the early 1960s, hauling freight under the name Midwestern Transportation. By the time they renamed it Midwestern Distribution in the early 70s, the dollar was doing its work. The fleet grew past 1,000 trucks, running coast to coast out of a southeast Kansas town most people in this country couldn't find on a map. At its peak, the operation employed more than 2,000 people, better than 500 of them, right there in Fort Scott, where Midwestern was about the biggest thing going. Understand what that meant for a town like Fort Scott. When one company is the paycheck for that many families, it doesn't just employ the place, it owns the mood of it. The diners filled when the trucks rolled in, and when the fleet was busy, the whole town was working. Whatever was good for Midwestern was good for Fort Scott. And that made it very easy not to ask too many questions about how the thing really ran. Here's how the dollar actually paid off, and it wasn't for the driver. The lease purchase contract put a new truck under a man for almost nothing down. And on paper, he was buying it, month by month, mile by mile. In practice, by the driver's own telling, very few of them ever reached the end of that lease and held the title. Most were running hard just to break even, covering the payment, the fuel, the upkeep, with little left to send home to a wife and kids who saw him a few days a month. A man would grind like that until he fell behind or burned out, or did the math one too many times and walked. And the same truck, with the same lease, got handed to the next driver who showed up chasing the same thing. The dream got recycled. The debt never went anywhere. It just changed hands. Every piece of the machine pointed back to the same place. When the truck needed parts or a shop, it went to B and D Motors, Midwestern's own parts and service arm, the company shop, just under a different name. When the company needed more drivers to fill more trucks, it ran its own training schools, including one up in Chicago, feeding green men fresh out of the classroom straight into the leases. The lease payment, the fuel, the parts, the repairs, all of it flowed back to the same company that had handed the man the keys for $1. He wasn't just the driver, he was the product and the customer at the same time. And the veterans knew it. The men who'd been around long enough saw the whole arrangement for exactly what it was. A training outfit with truck payments attached, a bad deal even at the time. But the pitch was never aimed at them. It was aimed at the driver who'd spent 10 years making other men rich and wanted just once to point at a truck in the yard and say that one's mine. The dollar wasn't really selling a truck. It was selling that feeling. And as long as there were men who wanted it badly enough, there was always another one to put in the seat. Put enough green men in big trucks in country they've never seen, and things go wrong. One story still gets told. Just one man's memory, so take it as flavor. A Midwestern driver up in Minnesota, in the dead of winter, went hunting for a spot to turn his rig around, took a flat sheet of snow-covered ice for an open field, and rolled out onto a frozen lake. It broke through under him. When the wrecker finally winched the truck back out, it tore the axles clean off. And it made the local news. Exactly the kind of attention a company doesn't want on its name. The truck itself told you who the deal was built for. These were White Freightliner cabovers, and under the cab sat a small cam Cummins, the 290-horse NTC, 855 cubic inches, the motor a lot of guys called the shiny 290. It was a child of the fuel crisis, an economy engine with a narrow power band and almost nothing down low. You had to keep it wound up in a tight little window, or it turned into a dog with a load behind it, which is why that engine wanted a gearbox with plenty of ratios to row through. Midwestern's trucks ran 10 speeds in the 76 Freightliners and 9 speeds in the 77s, all hung on that same little 290. But the part that gave the game away was the spec sheet. No Jake brake, that engine brake, the one that lets a man slow a loaded rig without cooking his service brakes, was an option you paid extra for, and Midwestern wouldn't pay for it. The trailer hand valve, standard on every tractor, they pulled off too. The way drivers understood it at the time, Too many of them had been leaning on the trailer brakes instead of the service brakes, wearing out trailer shoes the company was paying for. So, off came the valve. Picture what that left a man with: a loaded cab over, a gutless economy motor that wouldn't pull the hat off your head down low, and no engine brake to hold it coming down the far side of a grade. You made your time rowing that gearbox and riding the service brakes, and when those brakes faded or the linings wore out, that was your problem. The two things that most help a man earn out there, the power to make his time and the brakes to save his equipment, were the exact two things the company made sure these trucks went without. The truck wasn't built around the driver's paycheck. It was built around the company's costs. Then, in 1981, the Ellises sold the whole operation to Leaseway Transportation and walked away. The timing is the part worth sitting with. The year before, Congress had passed the Motor Carrier Act of 1980, and it tore up the rulebook on interstate trucking. The whole reason a single driver leased onto a carrier in the first place was to run under that carrier's operating authority. The hard-won government permission to haul certain freight on certain lanes that an individual could almost never get on his own. Deregulation made that authority easy to come by. The thing the carrier had been selling access to was suddenly worth a fraction of what it once was, and a brutal shakeout was coming for everyone who'd built a business on the old rules. The Ellises got out right at that line. Whether that was foresight or plain luck, nobody really knows. But they handed a 1970s business model to a giant at the exact moment the ground under it shifted. And Leaseway was a giant, a holding company with more than 110 subsidiaries, and by the mid-70s, the third largest publicly held transit company in the country. Even that didn't save it. Leaseway choked on its own buyout debt through the 80s, filed for bankruptcy in 1992, and clawed its way back out the year after. The company that bought the dollar truck empire barely survived the decade. The men who sold it never looked back, because the men who sold it had already worked out where the real money was. And it was never in the trucks. After the sale, the Ellises started a new company called Multi-Service Corporation, built to handle truckers' fuel needs, a fuel card and payment business, the financial plumbing that sits underneath every mile a truck turns. By the family's account, it grew into the largest aviation fuel card in the world. They later put more than $20 million into the Ellis Foundation, handing out scholarships. The fortune didn't come out of steel, it came out of the payments. For years, the drivers had chased ownership of a machine, a truck they could point to in the yard and call their own. And most of them walked away owning nothing. The founders never chased the machine at all. They owned the debt. Then they owned the system that moved the money. That's where the fortune sat the whole time. And the deal they built outlived all of them. Right now, today, you can find carriers advertising the same offer to drivers who want a rig of their own. 0 down, no money required to get started. The number went from $1 to nothing at all. The pitch never changed.